The cryo chamber hissed open, like an ancient tomb releasing its secrets. Steam billowed from the reinforced titanium pod as warming circuits hummed to life after decades of silence. Inside, perfectly preserved beneath layers of crystalline frost, lay a man whose simple blue jumpsuit bore a faded name tag reading Marcus Williams Custodial Services. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stepped back as the defrosting sequence completed its final cycle. Her research team had discovered this forgotten storage facility buried 3 levels beneath what used to be the Pentagon's basement archives. Among the politicians, generals, and scientists preserved for humanity's theoretical future, they had found him a janitor who someone had deemed important enough to freeze alongside Earth's most critical personnel. "Vitals are stabilizing," announced her assistant, Dr. James Chen, monitoring the medical readouts. "Brain activity is returning to normal patterns. He should regain consciousness within the next few minutes." Elena studied the sleeping figure with growing curiosity. Marcus appeared to be in his late 40s, with calloused hands that spoke of decades spent maintaining and fixing things others took for granted. His weathered face held a peaceful expression that seemed almost out of place in their current world of endless conflict and destruction. The year was 2087, 63 years after the Great Collapse had torn civilization apart. What began as resource wars between nations had evolved into something far worse. A perpetual state of conflict between 3 massive corporate armies that had absorbed the remnants of former governments. The Meridian Syndicate controlled the eastern territories with their advanced robotics and surveillance systems. The Phoenix Coalition dominated the West through superior air power and energy weapons. Between them, the Northern Alliance held the industrial heartlands with their heavy armor and artillery superiority. For 6 decades, these factions had ground each other down in an endless cycle of territorial gains and losses. Cities lay in ruins, infrastructure crumbled, and ordinary people survived in the margins, scavenging what they could while the war machines rolled overhead. The leaders of each faction had grown rich, selling weapons to each other while the world burned around them. Elena herself had grown up in this wasteland, earning her doctorate in cryogenic sciences by studying the preserved heroes of the past. The various factions paid her well to revive frozen assets: military strategists, weapons designers, anyone who might provide an edge in the eternal conflict. But Marcus Williams represented a mystery that had intrigued her for months. According to the fragmented records they had recovered, Marcus had been the head custodian for the entire Pentagon complex during the final years before the collapse. Someone with significant authority had ordered his preservation, but all records of who and why had been lost in the chaos that followed. His personnel file contained only basic information: 47 years old, 30 years of government service, expert ratings in building maintenance, security systems, and logistics coordination. Marcus stirred as the warming process reached completion. His eyelids fluttered, then opened slowly, revealing sharp gray eyes that immediately began taking in his surroundings with methodical precision. Elena noticed he didn't appear panicked or confused like most revival subjects. Instead, he seemed to be cataloging every detail of the room with the thoroughness of someone trained to notice what others missed. "Take it slow," Elena said gently, offering him a cup of warm water. "You've been in cryogenic suspension for 63 years. Your body needs time to readjust." Marcus accepted the water and sipped it carefully, his gaze never stopping its systematic scan of the laboratory. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being underestimated. 63 years, he repeated thoughtfully. "I assume things didn't go well after they put me under." Elena exchanged glances with Dr. Chen. Most revival subjects needed extensive briefing periods to accept their new reality. Marcus seemed to be processing the implications with unsettling calm. "The world changed significantly," Elena explained carefully. "The resource conflicts escalated into what we call the Great Collapse. The old governments fell, and corporate armies took control of different regions. We've been in a state of perpetual warfare ever since." Marcus nodded as if this outcome had been entirely predictable. "And you revived me because someone thinks a janitor might be useful in cleaning up this mess?" The question caught Elena off guard. She had expected confusion, denial, perhaps anger at learning his world was gone. Instead, Marcus seemed almost amused by the situation. "We're not entirely sure why you were preserved," she admitted. "Your records are incomplete. But every person in that facility was selected for specific strategic value. We're hoping you can help us understand what that value might be." Marcus finished his water and began the slow process of sitting up. His movements were careful but deliberate, testing his physical capabilities with the methodical approach of someone who understood the importance of knowing his own limitations. "Dr. Rodriguez," he said, having apparently read her name badge during his visual survey. "Before we discuss my potential usefulness, perhaps you could explain exactly who we represents. Which faction currently employs your services?" Elena hesitated. The question revealed more awareness than she had expected from someone just emerging from decades of suspension. "Currently, we're working under contract with the Meridian Syndicate. They control this territory and funded the excavation of the cryo facility." "I see," Marcus replied, though his tone suggested he saw considerably more than he was revealing. "And I assume this means the other factions have similar assets they're attempting to leverage against each other." "All three major powers have revival programs," Dr. Chen confirmed. "They're constantly searching for any advantage, any forgotten resource that might tip the balance in their favor." Marcus was quiet for several minutes, appearing to process this information while continuing his subtle examination of the room. Elena noticed he paid particular attention to the security cameras, the electronic locks on the doors, and the various computer terminals that controlled the laboratory's systems. "Dr. Rodriguez," he finally said, "I'd like to understand something about the current situation. You mentioned perpetual warfare, but these factions must have infrastructure, supply lines, command structures. How do they maintain operations after 6 decades of constant conflict?" The question struck Elena as oddly specific for someone just learning about their world, but she answered thoroughly. "Each faction controls specific industrial centers and resource extraction sites. They've developed a complex network of automated factories, supply convoys, and communication systems. The war has actually driven remarkable technological advancement in some areas." "Automated systems," Marcus repeated, with what might have been satisfaction. "And I assume these systems require maintenance, coordination, oversight?" "Constantly," Dr. Chen interjected. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us." Now back to the story. "It's one of the major limiting factors in their military effectiveness. Keeping everything running smoothly requires enormous resources and personnel." Marcus smiled slightly, and Elena felt a chill of recognition. It was the expression of someone who had just been handed the solution to a puzzle they had been working on for a very long time. Before she could pursue that thought further, the laboratory's main door opened to admit Colonel Harrison Webb, the Meridian Syndicate's liaison officer for the revival program. Webb was a career military man who viewed every situation through the lens of tactical advantage and potential threat assessment. "Dr. Rodriguez," Webb announced without preamble, "I trust our new asset is ready for debriefing." Marcus turned his attention to the colonel with the same methodical observation he had applied to everything else. Elena watched as he took in Webb's uniform details, insignia, and bearing with the thoroughness of someone trained to read military hierarchies. "Colonel Webb," Marcus said before Elena could make introductions, "Head of Tactical Integration for the Meridian Syndicate's Special Assets Division. Former Army Ranger, approximately 15 years of combat experience, currently responsible for extracting value from historical resources." Webb's eyebrows rose sharply. "How did your posture, equipment preferences, and the specific way you enter a room," Marcus explained calmly. "Plus the fact that someone with your apparent rank wouldn't personally oversee a routine debriefing unless the subject was considered potentially significant." Elena realized she was witnessing something remarkable. Marcus wasn't just observant. He was reading people and situations with the skill of a trained intelligence analyst, yet his records indicated nothing more than custodial work. "Mr. Williams," Webb said, recovering his composure, "I'd like to discuss your background and potential applications to our current operational needs." "Certainly," Marcus replied, swinging his legs over the side of the revival chamber. Though I should mention that my background might be more relevant than your preliminary research suggests. Webb gestured toward a nearby conference room, and the group relocated for what Elena assumed would be a standard debriefing session. Marcus moved with increasing steadiness, his body adapting quickly to post-revival conditions. She noticed he continued his systematic observation, paying particular attention to the facility's layout and security arrangements. Once seated around the conference table, Webb activated a recording device and opened a tablet containing Marcus's personnel files. According to these records, you were employed as head custodian for the Pentagon complex from 2019 to 2024. Your duties included building maintenance, security coordination, and logistics support. That's accurate, Marcus confirmed, though perhaps incomplete. In what way? Marcus leaned back in his chair, and Elena noticed his entire demeanor had shifted. The slightly confused revival subject had been replaced by someone who radiated quiet authority. Colonel, in my 30 years of government service, I was responsible for maintaining facilities that housed some of the most sensitive operations in human history. The Pentagon isn't just an office building. It's the nerve center for global military coordination. A head custodian in that environment doesn't just empty trash cans and mop floors. Webb's attention sharpened. Continue. I held security clearances that gave me access to virtually every area of the complex. I understood the building's systems better than the people who designed them. I knew which generals met with which contractors, which projects received priority funding, which operations were succeeding, and which were failing. Marcus paused, allowing the implications to sink in. Most importantly, I understood how everything connected. Elena felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. A custodian with high-level access would be invisible to most personnel, while having unprecedented insight into operations across all levels of command. The custodial staff were the circulatory system of the entire complex, Marcus continued. We moved through every office, every meeting room, every classified facility. We saw the documents that weren't properly secured, overheard the conversations that happened after official meetings ended, noticed the patterns that the decision-makers were too busy to recognize. Webb was now giving Marcus his complete attention. And you believe this knowledge is relevant to our current situation? Colonel, the three factions currently tearing this world apart are making the same fundamental mistakes that led to the original collapse. They're so focused on outgunning each other that they've ignored the basic principles of sustainable operations. Their systems are inefficient, their communications are vulnerable, and their leadership has become disconnected from the reality of their own organizations. Elena watched as Webb processed this assessment. The colonel was clearly trying to determine whether Marcus represented a valuable asset or simply an old man with inflated opinions about his own importance. Mr. Williams, Webb said carefully, you've been in suspension for over 6 decades. How can you possibly assess our current operational status? Marcus smiled again, and Elena realized she was beginning to recognize that expression as a warning sign. Colonel, in the past hour, I've observed your security protocols, analyzed your facility's layout, and listened to detailed descriptions of how the three factions operate. I've also noticed approximately 17 separate inefficiencies in your immediate operations that are probably costing you significant resources. Webb's skepticism was evident. 17 inefficiencies in 1 hour? Would you like me to demonstrate? Marcus asked politely. Webb gestured for him to proceed, and Elena found herself leaning forward with anticipation. Your security cameras are positioned to monitor personnel movement, but they're angled incorrectly to detect actual security threats. The laboratory's air filtration system is running at maximum capacity, despite minimal contamination risk, wasting approximately 30% of your power budget. Your communication protocols require 3 separate authentications for routine information transfer, creating bottlenecks that delay critical operations by an average of 8 minutes per transaction. Marcus continued his assessment with methodical precision, identifying problems that ranged from inefficient use of storage space to security vulnerabilities in their computer networks. Elena realized that each observation was accurate and represented exactly the kind of systematic waste that accumulated in complex organizations. Furthermore, Marcus concluded, your current debriefing protocol is taking place in a room with acoustic properties that make it easy to monitor from 3 separate locations within this facility. If operational security was a genuine priority, we would be meeting somewhere else. Webb's expression had shifted from skepticism to serious interest. You identified all of this through casual observation? Colonel, I spent 30 years learning to see how complex systems actually function versus how they're supposed to function. Most problems in large organizations aren't caused by dramatic failures. They're caused by thousands of small inefficiencies that compound over time until they cripple overall effectiveness. Elena suddenly understood why someone had ordered Marcus preserved. He wasn't just a custodian. He was a systems analyst who understood the hidden mechanics of institutional operations. In their current world of sprawling corporate armies, such knowledge would be invaluable. What would you recommend? Webb asked, his tone now reflecting genuine curiosity. That depends, Marcus replied, on whether the Meridian Syndicate is interested in winning this war or simply perpetuating it. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Elena saw Webb's face harden as he processed the implications. Explain that distinction. Marcus stood and walked to the room's whiteboard, picking up a marker with the confident movement of someone about to deliver a lecture. The current conflict serves certain interests very well, he began, sketching a simple diagram. Weapons manufacturers, logistics contractors, reconstruction companies. They profit enormously from perpetual warfare. The faction leaders maintain power by positioning themselves as essential for survival against eternal threats. He drew connecting lines between different elements of his diagram, illustrating the relationships between various power centers. But actual victory would disrupt this profitable equilibrium. A truly effective military force could end this conflict within months, which would eliminate the justification for the current power structure. Webb leaned forward. Are you suggesting the factions are deliberately maintaining the stalemate? I'm suggesting that institutions tend to optimize for their own survival rather than their stated objectives, Marcus replied. The question is whether anyone in leadership position genuinely wants to solve the underlying problems or simply manage them indefinitely. Elena realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. Marcus wasn't just offering to help the Meridian Syndicate fight more effectively. He was challenging the fundamental assumptions underlying the entire conflict. Mr. Williams, Webb said slowly, assuming for the moment that we are interested in actual resolution rather than perpetual management, what would you recommend? Marcus capped the marker and returned to his seat. I'd recommend we start by understanding what this war is really about. Strip away the propaganda and examine the underlying resource flows, communication patterns, and decision-making structures. Once you understand how the system actually works, you can identify the specific points where small changes would produce large effects. You're talking about targeting infrastructure rather than military assets. I'm talking about targeting inefficiency rather than enemies, Marcus corrected. In my experience, most conflicts persist because the systems supporting them are poorly designed, not because the opposing forces are particularly competent. Webb activated his tablet and began taking notes. Elena could see the colonel's tactical mind engaging with Marcus's strategic framework. Give me a specific example, Webb requested. Marcus considered for a moment. Your current intelligence gathering focuses on enemy troop movements, weapons capabilities, and tactical intentions. How much attention do you pay to their supply chain management, maintenance schedules, or administrative procedures? Those aren't typically considered high-priority intelligence targets. Exactly. But those mundane systems determine whether enemy forces can actually execute their tactical plans. A brilliantly conceived military operation becomes irrelevant if the fuel doesn't arrive on schedule, if critical equipment isn't properly maintained, or if communication delays prevent coordinated action. Elena watched as Webb processed this perspective. The colonel was clearly recognizing implications that hadn't occurred to traditional military thinking. You're suggesting we focus on degrading enemy efficiency rather than destroying enemy assets? I'm suggesting that efficiency degradation is often more effective than asset destruction, Marcus clarified. Destroying a tank requires significant resources and has obvious strategic value, but causing that tank to break down at the wrong moment, or ensuring its fuel supply is unreliable, or disrupting the communication systems that coordinate its deployment, those approaches often achieve the same result with far less resource investment. Webb was now taking extensive notes. How would such an approach be implemented? Marcus smiled, and Elena realized they were about to receive a masterclass in unconventional warfare from someone who had spent decades studying how complex systems could be optimized or disrupted. Colonel, That depends on whether you're genuinely interested in ending this conflict or simply gaining advantage within it, because the methods I'm describing would work against all three factions, including your own. The implication was clear. Marcus was offering knowledge that could reshape the entire conflict, but only if the Meridian Syndicate was prepared to fundamentally change their approach to the war. Webb closed his tablet and leaned back in his chair. Mr. Williams, I think this conversation needs to continue at a much higher level. Would you be willing to present these concepts to senior leadership? Certainly, Marcus replied. Though I should mention that effective implementation would require access to detailed operational data about all three factions, not just intelligence about enemy capabilities. Why would you need information about our own operations? Because optimal system design requires understanding all components, not just the ones you want to improve. If the Meridian Syndicate is serious about ending this conflict, you'll need to identify and address inefficiencies in your own organization first. Elena realized that Marcus had just requested access to some of the most sensitive information in the Meridian Syndicate's possession. Either he was remarkably naive about organizational security, or he understood something about institutional change that the rest of them were missing. I'll need to discuss this with my superiors, Webb said. In the meantime, I'd like you to remain available for additional consultation. Of course, Marcus agreed, though I hope you'll consider moving quickly. The longer this conflict continues, the more entrenched the inefficiencies become. As the meeting concluded, Elena found herself wondering exactly what they had awakened. Marcus Williams had presented himself as a simple custodian, but his strategic thinking and systems analysis capabilities suggested something far more complex. Moreover, his calm confidence in the face of a completely transformed world indicated either remarkable adaptability or prior knowledge of what he might encounter. Over the following days, Elena had multiple opportunities to observe Marcus as he underwent additional medical evaluations and orientation sessions. Each interaction reinforced her growing conviction that there was significantly more to his background than the official records indicated. During a routine physical examination, Marcus demonstrated familiarity with medical equipment that went far beyond basic first aid training. When Dr. Chen tested his cognitive functions, Marcus not only performed exceptionally, but offered suggestions for improving the testing protocols themselves. Most tellingly, when security personnel conducted what they believed was a discreet background verification, Marcus showed clear awareness of their activities without appearing to pay attention to them. Dr. Rodriguez, Marcus said during one of their private conversations, I'd like to ask you something about the current faction leadership. In your experience, do they strike you as people who genuinely believe in their stated objectives? Elena considered the question carefully. She had worked with representatives from all three factions over the years, and Marcus's question touched on something she had noticed but never explicitly articulated. I think most of them started with genuine convictions, she answered slowly. But after decades of conflict, they seem more focused on maintaining their positions than achieving their original goals. Marcus nodded as if this confirmed his expectations. That's consistent with what I observed in government service. Institutional momentum tends to outlast individual motivation. People become invested in processes rather than outcomes. Is that why you think this conflict can be resolved? Because the leadership isn't as committed as they appear? Partly, Marcus replied. But more importantly, I think the current system is inherently unstable. It's consuming resources faster than it can generate them, and the inefficiencies are compounding over time. Eventually, something will force a change whether the leadership wants one or not. Elena found herself thinking about this conversation as she prepared her reports for the Meridian Syndicate. Marcus's assessment of systemic instability aligned with her own observations about resource depletion and infrastructure decay across all three faction territories. 3 days after his revival, Marcus was summoned to present his analysis to General Patricia Morrison, the Meridian Syndicate's regional commander. Elena was included in the meeting as the responsible scientist, along with Colonel Webb and several other senior officers. General Morrison was a veteran of 4 decades of continuous warfare, and her approach to strategic problems reflected that experience. She listened to Marcus's initial presentation with polite attention, but Elena could see skepticism in her expression. Mr. Williams, General Morrison said when Marcus concluded his overview, your analysis of systematic inefficiencies is interesting, but I'm not convinced it addresses our fundamental challenge. The Phoenix Coalition has superior air power, and the Northern Alliance has heavier ground forces. Those are concrete military advantages that can't be resolved through better administration. Marcus had clearly anticipated this objection. General, may I ask how much of your current resource allocation goes toward countering those specific advantages? Approximately 60% of our military budget focuses on air defense and heavy armor development, Colonel Webb provided. And how effective have those investments been in neutralizing enemy advantages? General Morrison's expression tightened slightly. We've achieved parity in most operational scenarios. Parity, Marcus repeated thoughtfully. Which means that after decades of massive resource investment, you've reached a position where you can avoid losing rather than actually winning. Elena watched as the general processed this reframing of their strategic situation. Morrison was clearly uncomfortable with the implication that their military approach had been fundamentally defensive. What alternative would you propose? Morrison asked. Marcus walked to the presentation screen and called up a diagram he had prepared, showing resource flows between the three factions. General, this conflict persists because all three factions are optimizing for the same metrics: firepower, territorial control, and resource extraction. You're essentially competing in a game where the rules guarantee that no one can achieve decisive victory. He highlighted specific data points on his diagram, but the game itself depends on infrastructure that all three factions share: communication networks, transportation systems, energy distribution, and supply chain management. Those shared systems represent single points of failure that could reshape the entire conflict. General Morrison leaned forward. You're proposing to attack civilian infrastructure? I'm proposing to optimize it, Marcus corrected. Most of the infrastructure supporting this conflict is grossly inefficient, because it was designed piecemeal over 6 decades of emergency conditions. Small improvements in key systems could dramatically alter the strategic balance without requiring massive military investment. Elena realized that Marcus was offering something unprecedented, a way to gain decisive advantage through engineering rather than warfare. Give me a specific example, Morrison demanded. Marcus pulled up detailed schematics that Elena realized he must have compiled from publicly available information about regional infrastructure. The three factions share certain communication relay stations that were built before the current territorial divisions. These stations handle routine coordination between civilian populations, but they also carry military communications during peak usage periods. He highlighted specific relay points on the map. Currently, these stations operate at approximately 40% efficiency due to outdated protocols and inadequate maintenance. Simple upgrades could triple their capacity while improving security and reducing power consumption. General Morrison studied the schematics. And you believe this would provide strategic advantage? How? Because the faction that implemented these upgrades first would have superior communication capabilities, which translates directly into coordination advantages in complex operations. More importantly, they could offer communication services to civilian populations in contested territories, creating strategic relationships that don't depend purely on military control. Elena watched as the room full of military officers grappled with Marcus's unconventional approach. He was proposing to win through superior service delivery rather than superior firepower. Mr. Williams, Morrison said slowly, this sounds like you're describing a business strategy rather than a military one. Marcus smiled. General, what do you think warfare has become after 6 decades of corporate armies? This conflict is fundamentally about resource allocation and organizational efficiency. The faction that best delivers essential services to the population will eventually absorb the territories currently held by less effective competitors. The meeting continued for another 2 hours as Marcus presented detailed analyses of transportation networks, energy systems, and supply chain bottlenecks. Each presentation reinforced his central argument that systematic efficiency improvements could provide advantages that traditional military approaches couldn't match. When the meeting concluded, General Morrison asked Marcus to remain behind for a private conversation. Mr. Williams, she said once the others had left, your proposals are intriguing, but they would require a fundamental shift in how we approach this conflict. That kind of change involves enormous political and financial risk. Quote, General, Marcus replied, With respect, maintaining the current approach involves even greater risk. The Meridian Syndicate's resource burn rate is unsustainable. Your infrastructure is deteriorating faster than you can repair it. Your personnel are experiencing increasing rates of resignation and defection. The current strategy might maintain short-term stability, but it guarantees long-term collapse. Morrison was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing Marcus's assessment against her own understanding of their strategic position. "Assuming for the moment that you're correct about systemic instability," she said finally, "how would you propose implementing these efficiency improvements without triggering immediate military responses from the other factions?" Marcus leaned forward. "General, that's the beauty of this approach. Infrastructure improvements that genuinely serve civilian populations can't be effectively targeted by military action without alienating the very people the other factions claim to protect." Elena realized that Marcus had identified a strategic opportunity that traditional military thinking had overlooked. By focusing on civilian service delivery, the Meridian Syndicate could gain strategic advantages that would be politically difficult for their enemies to counter. "I need time to consider this," Morrison said. "Colonel Webb will coordinate with you on additional analysis. I want detailed implementation timelines and resource requirements for your top 3 recommendations." As they left the meeting, Elena found herself walking alongside Marcus through the facility's corridors. She had been observing him carefully for nearly a week, and certain patterns in his behavior were becoming apparent. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I have a question that's been bothering me since your revival." He turned to look at her with his characteristic expression of polite attention. "You're adapting to this situation remarkably well for someone whose entire world disappeared while they were in suspension. Most revival subjects experience significant psychological trauma from temporal displacement. You seem almost comfortable with it." Marcus was quiet for a moment as they continued walking. When he finally responded, his tone was more serious than Elena had heard before. "Dr. Rodriguez, I think there are things about the pre-collapse period that your historical records don't fully capture. The signs of systemic instability were apparent to anyone who knew how to recognize them. The resource wars, the infrastructure decay, the breakdown of institutional coordination. Those weren't sudden developments." Elena stopped walking. "Are you saying you expected this outcome?" "I'm saying that people in certain positions could see it coming," Marcus replied carefully. The question was whether anything could be done to mitigate the worst effects. Elena felt a chill of recognition. "Marcus, exactly what was your role in the pre-collapse government?" Marcus looked at her for a long moment, and Elena realized he was making a decision about how much to reveal. "Dr. Rodriguez, my official title was head custodian, and that wasn't inaccurate. But custodial services in high-security facilities often involve responsibilities that go beyond building maintenance." Elena stared at him. "You were intelligence." "I was someone who understood how information flowed through complex organizations," Marcus said diplomatically, "and who recognized that the most valuable intelligence often came from understanding mundane operational details rather than dramatic secrets." Elena realized that everything about Marcus's behavior since revival suddenly made sense. His systematic observation, his detailed analysis of organizational inefficiencies, his comfort with strategic planning. These weren't the skills of a janitor who had been accidentally preserved. They were the capabilities of someone who had been specifically trained for exactly this type of situation. "How many others are there?" she asked. How many people were preserved with specific knowledge for post-collapse recovery? Marcus smiled slightly. "Dr. Rodriguez, that's a very good question. And I suspect the answer might surprise all 3 factions currently fighting for control of this continent." Elena felt pieces of a much larger puzzle beginning to emerge. Marcus Williams might not be the only pre-collapse asset with specialized knowledge waiting to be discovered. And if there were others, their combined capabilities could reshape the entire conflict in ways that none of the current faction leaders had anticipated. That evening, Elena found herself reviewing everything she knew about the various cryogenic facilities that had been discovered across the continent. Most contained predictable selections of military officers, scientists, and political leaders. But some, like the facility where Marcus had been found, included personnel whose strategic value wasn't immediately apparent. Elena began compiling a list of other mundane personnel who had been preserved alongside obvious strategic assets. Maintenance supervisors, logistics coordinators, administrative assistants, communication technicians, people whose value wasn't obvious unless you understood the critical role that organizational infrastructure played in complex operations. Meanwhile, Marcus was working with Colonel Webb to develop detailed implementation plans for infrastructure improvements. Elena observed these sessions when possible and noticed that Marcus's recommendations consistently focused on systems that would have cascading effects across multiple operational areas. His first priority was upgrading communication networks, not just for military advantage but to improve coordination between civilian services. His second focus was transportation efficiency, which would benefit both military logistics and civilian commerce. His third emphasis was energy distribution, which affected everything from weapons production to agricultural output. Elena realized that Marcus was designing a comprehensive transformation of the Meridian Syndicate's operational approach. Rather than simply optimizing military capabilities, he was restructuring their entire relationship with the territories they controlled. 2 weeks after his revival, Marcus's first infrastructure project was approved for implementation. The Meridian Syndicate would upgrade communication relays in 3 contested border regions, ostensibly to improve military coordination, but actually to provide better civilian services. Elena watched as Marcus coordinated the project implementation with the methodical precision she had come to expect from him, but she also noticed that he was training Meridian Syndicate personnel to understand the principles behind his recommendations, rather than simply following his instructions. "Dr. Rodriguez," Marcus said during one of their conversations, "I want to make sure you understand something important about what we're doing here." Elena looked up from her notes. "What's that?" "The goal isn't to make the Meridian Syndicate more effective at perpetuating this conflict. The goal is to make them so effective at serving civilian populations that the conflict becomes irrelevant." Elena stared at him. "You're trying to end the war by making it unnecessary?" "I'm trying to demonstrate that cooperation produces better results than competition," Marcus replied. "Once people experience the benefits of efficient systems and reliable services, they become less interested in supporting organizations that can't provide those things." Elena realized that Marcus's strategy was even more ambitious than she had understood. He wasn't just trying to help one faction win. He was trying to transform the entire basis of the conflict, from military competition to civilian service delivery. 3 weeks after the communication upgrade project began, reports started filtering in from the border regions. Civilian populations were responding positively to improved services, and local cooperation with Meridian Syndicate forces was increasing noticeably. More importantly, similar improvements were being requested by civilian groups in territories controlled by the other factions. Elena watched as Marcus reviewed these reports with obvious satisfaction. His strategy was working exactly as he had predicted. Service improvements were creating political pressure that crossed factional boundaries. "Colonel Webb," Marcus said during their next planning session, "I think it's time to expand our approach. The other factions are going to respond to what we're doing, and we need to be prepared for their reactions." Webb looked up from his analysis reports. "What kind of reactions are you expecting?" Marcus pulled up a map showing recent activity across all 3 faction territories. The Phoenix Coalition has started announcing their own infrastructure improvement projects, and the Northern Alliance is increasing their civilian service budgets. They're recognizing that military superiority alone isn't sufficient if civilian populations prefer working with competitors. Elena realized they were witnessing the beginning of a fundamental shift in how the conflict was being conducted. Instead of purely military competition, the factions were starting to compete on civilian service delivery. "What's our next move?" Webb asked. Marcus smiled, and Elena recognized the expression that indicated he was about to reveal the next phase of a carefully planned strategy. "Colonel, I think it's time to share some of our techniques with the other factions." Webb stared at him. "Share our advantages? Why would we do that?" "Because the goal isn't to maintain advantages over competitors," Marcus explained patiently. "The goal is to transform the competition itself into something that benefits everyone." Elena watched as Webb struggled to process this concept. Traditional military thinking focused on zero-sum competition, where one side's gain required another side's loss. Marcus was proposing positive-sum competition, where all sides could improve simultaneously. "Mr. Williams," Webb said slowly, "I'm not sure I understand how helping our enemies serves our interests." Marcus walked to the whiteboard and began sketching another diagram. Colonel, what happens when all three factions become more efficient at serving civilian populations? Webb considered the question. Presumably, civilian satisfaction increases across all territories. Exactly. And what happens when civilian populations are satisfied with their governments and services? Elena suddenly understood where Marcus was leading. They stop supporting military conflicts that disrupt their lives. Marcus nodded. The current conflict persists partly because civilian populations have no alternatives to the faction that controls their territory. But if all three factions become genuinely effective at civilian service delivery, people start demanding that their leaders focus on governance rather than warfare. Webb was now taking notes again. You're proposing to end the conflict by making it politically unsustainable for all sides. I'm proposing to end the conflict by making cooperation more profitable than competition, Marcus corrected. When leaders realize they can achieve better results through coordination than through conflict, most of them will choose coordination. Elena realized that Marcus had just outlined a strategy for transforming the entire continental political structure without requiring military victory by any single faction. It was an approach that could end the war by making war itself obsolete. As she watched Marcus begin planning the next phase of his strategy, Elena understood that she was witnessing something unprecedented in the post-collapse world. Someone had finally figured out how to turn the endless cycle of conflict into an opportunity for genuine reconstruction. The janitor who had been preserved to clean up after the war was actually cleaning up the war itself, and Elena suspected that Marcus Williams was just getting started. They defrosted a human janitor. He cleaned up the entire war, Part 2, finale. General Patricia Morrison received the emergency transmission at 0347 hours. The Phoenix Coalition had mobilized their entire air fleet and was advancing toward Meridian territory with overwhelming force. Intelligence reports indicated they intended to eliminate what they called the infrastructure threat before it could spread further. Marcus Williams stood in the command center reviewing tactical displays with the calm demeanor of someone who had anticipated this exact scenario. Around him, Meridian officers prepared defensive responses with the urgency of people facing potential annihilation. They're bringing everything, Colonel Webb reported grimly. 400 attack aircraft, orbital bombardment platforms, and electromagnetic pulse weapons designed to destroy our communication upgrades. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. How long until they reach our primary facilities? 6 hours maximum. Excellent, Marcus replied. And Elena Rodriguez noticed he seemed almost pleased by this development. Colonel, please initiate Protocol 7 across all our upgraded infrastructure. Webb hesitated. Sir, Protocol 7 will shut down every system we've spent months improving. We'll lose all our advantages. Temporarily, Marcus agreed. Dr. Rodriguez, would you please contact the civilian evacuation coordinators and confirm they're ready to implement the shelter procedures we discussed? Elena activated her communication device with growing confusion. Marcus had insisted on developing elaborate civilian protection protocols that had seemed unnecessarily complex for infrastructure improvements. Now she realized those protocols might serve an entirely different purpose. Marcus, she said quietly, what exactly is Protocol 7? Marcus smiled with the expression Elena had learned meant he was about to reveal information that would change everyone's understanding of their situation. Dr. Rodriguez, Protocol 7 converts our entire infrastructure network into the largest early warning system ever constructed. Elena stared at him as the implications became clear. The communication relays, transportation sensors, and energy distribution monitors they had installed weren't just efficiency improvements. They were components of a comprehensive detection network that could track military movements across the entire continent. You've been building intelligence-gathering capabilities disguised as civilian services, she realized. I've been building civilian services that happen to provide excellent intelligence-gathering capabilities, Marcus corrected. The distinction matters because one approach is an act of war, while the other is an act of governance. General Morrison approached their station with an expression that mixed admiration with exasperation. Mr. Williams, I'm beginning to understand that you've been planning this confrontation from the moment of your revival. General, I've been planning for the inevitable moment when someone would try to destroy progress through force, Marcus replied. The question was whether we could make such destruction counterproductive for the aggressors. Morrison activated her tactical display. "Explain," Marcus gestured toward the approaching Phoenix Coalition forces. "General, they're about to demonstrate to every civilian population on the continent that they consider improved services and infrastructure to be military threats worthy of destruction." Elena suddenly understood the brilliance of Marcus's strategy. The Phoenix Coalition couldn't attack infrastructure improvements without appearing to attack civilian welfare. Their military response would expose them as opponents of progress, rather than protectors of their own people. Furthermore, Marcus continued, they're concentrating their entire air fleet in a single operation, which means their other territories are currently defenseless against the very infrastructure improvements they're trying to prevent. General Morrison studied the tactical display with new understanding. "You're suggesting we use their attack as cover for expanding operations elsewhere?" "I'm suggesting we help civilian populations throughout Phoenix territory experience the benefits of efficient infrastructure while their military forces are busy destroying it here," Marcus clarified. Elena watched as Morrison processed this strategic reversal. Instead of defending against the attack, Marcus was proposing to use it as an opportunity for expansion. "Sir," Colonel Webb interjected, "we don't have forces positioned for operations in Phoenix territory." Marcus walked to a communication terminal. "Colonel, we don't need military forces. We need maintenance crews." Over the next hour, Marcus coordinated what he called emergency civilian assistance operations throughout Phoenix Coalition territory. Teams of technicians, engineers, and logistics specialists moved into regions where infrastructure had been neglected due to military resource allocation. Elena realized these weren't random repair crews. They were the same personnel who had implemented infrastructure improvements in Meridian territory, now applying identical techniques to serve Phoenix civilian populations while their military was absent. "This is incredible," Dr. Chen observed as reports filtered in. "Phoenix civilians are actively assisting our teams because they're providing services their own government hasn't delivered in years." Marcus nodded with satisfaction. "People generally support whoever solves their problems most effectively, regardless of political affiliation." The Phoenix Coalition's attack arrived precisely on schedule, concentrated against the communication relays and transportation hubs that had made Meridian territory more efficient. Elena watched from the command bunker as electromagnetic pulses disabled systems that had taken months to construct. But instead of appearing victorious, the Phoenix forces found themselves attacking infrastructure that civilian populations throughout the continent now understood as beneficial to their daily lives. The attack was being broadcast across every remaining communication network, showing military forces destroying hospitals, schools, and transportation systems. "Sir," the communications officer reported, "we're receiving requests for assistance from civilian groups in Northern Alliance territory. They're asking for infrastructure improvements and offering to provide support for implementation teams." General Morrison looked at Marcus with something approaching awe. "You've turned a military attack into a recruitment opportunity." Marcus was monitoring multiple data streams simultaneously, tracking not just the immediate battle but the broader political responses across all three faction territories. "General, this attack is accelerating a transformation that would have taken years to accomplish through gradual expansion." Elena understood that Marcus had anticipated this exact scenario. The Phoenix Coalition's overwhelming response was validating his approach to every civilian population that witnessed it. "Dr. Rodriguez," Marcus said, "please contact our teams in Phoenix territory and confirm they're ready to implement emergency restoration protocols." Elena realized that Marcus had prepared for the aftermath of the attack just as thoroughly as he had prepared for the attack itself. Restoration teams were already positioned to repair damaged infrastructure using improved techniques that would make services better than they had been before the assault. "You're going to rebuild their targets as upgraded systems," she said. "We're going to rebuild them as examples of what cooperation can accomplish," Marcus replied. "By the time Phoenix forces return to their home territories, they'll find civilian populations experiencing better services than they've had in decades." The attack concluded after 18 hours of intensive bombardment. Phoenix forces had successfully destroyed most of the infrastructure improvements in Meridian territory, but reports were already arriving about civilian uprisings in their own regions. General Morrison reviewed the situation reports with a mixture of concern and amazement. "Mr. Williams, Phoenix territory is experiencing civil unrest in 14 major population centers. Civilians are demanding explanation for why their military attacked infrastructure that provided services they desperately needed. Marcus was coordinating restoration efforts with the same methodical precision Elena had observed throughout his revival period. General, people are recognizing that military action against civilian infrastructure serves no legitimate governmental purpose. Elena watched as reports continued arriving from across the continent. The attack had triggered exactly the response Marcus had predicted. Instead of eliminating the threat of infrastructure improvement, the Phoenix Coalition had demonstrated to their own citizens that they considered such improvements threatening. "Sir," Colonel Webb reported, "Northern Alliance forces are requesting permission to cross into Phoenix territory to assist with civilian emergency services." Elena stared at this development. The third faction was offering humanitarian assistance to populations whose own military had just attacked beneficial infrastructure. "Grant permission," General Morrison decided, "and coordinate with Northern Alliance teams to ensure our restoration efforts complement their assistance operations." Marcus looked up from his coordination displays with obvious satisfaction. "General, I believe we're witnessing the end of the three-faction system." Elena realized he was correct. The arbitrary territorial divisions that had maintained the perpetual conflict were dissolving as civilian populations began cooperating across factional boundaries to restore and improve essential services. Over the following weeks, the transformation accelerated beyond anyone's expectations except Marcus's. The Phoenix Coalition's leadership found themselves facing widespread civilian demands for cooperation with the other factions to implement infrastructure improvements. Elena observed as delegation after delegation arrived at Meridian headquarters requesting assistance with transportation networks, communication systems, and energy distribution. These weren't military surrenders, but civilian initiatives that bypassed factional leadership entirely. "Dr. Rodriguez," Marcus said during one of their final planning sessions, "I'd like you to consider something important about what we've accomplished here." Elena looked up from her reports documenting the systematic replacement of military governance with civilian service delivery. "We haven't actually defeated anyone," Marcus continued. "We've simply demonstrated that cooperation produces better results than competition. Most people, including military leadership, prefer better results when given genuine alternatives." Elena realized that Marcus had achieved something unprecedented in post-collapse history. Instead of one faction conquering the others, he had made factional competition irrelevant by proving that civilian service delivery was more important than territorial control. General Morrison approached their station carrying documents that Elena recognized as formal agreements between the three former factions. "Mr. Williams," Morrison announced, "I'm pleased to inform you that we've reached consensus on establishing the Continental Cooperation Council. Military forces from all three factions will be integrated into civilian service delivery rather than territorial defense." Marcus accepted the documents with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose long-term planning had achieved its intended results. "General, I assume this means former faction leaders will serve as regional coordinators for infrastructure development rather than military commanders." "Correct. The transition will take approximately 2 years, but we're already seeing efficiency improvements that exceed anything achieved during the conflict period." Elena realized she was witnessing the end of the 63-year war through systematic optimization rather than military victory. Marcus had transformed the competition from military effectiveness to governmental competence, and governmental competence required cooperation rather than conflict. 6 months later, Elena stood in the observation deck of the rebuilt communication center that had been among the first targets of the Phoenix Coalition's final attack. The facility now served as headquarters for Continental Infrastructure Coordination, processing requests from civilian populations across former factional boundaries. Marcus Williams had officially been appointed Continental Systems Coordinator, though Elena noticed he still preferred to describe himself as responsible for maintenance and cleaning. The distinction seemed important to him, representing his fundamental belief that complex systems required constant attention to mundane details rather than dramatic interventions. "Dr. Rodriguez," Marcus said, joining her at the observation window, "I wanted to thank you for your role in making this transformation possible." Elena looked at him with the respect she had developed for someone whose strategic thinking had reshaped an entire continent. "Marcus, I have one final question that's been bothering me since your revival." He turned to her with his characteristic expression of polite attention. "How many others are there? How many people were preserved with the specific knowledge needed to rebuild civilization after the collapse?" Marcus smiled, and Elena realized she was about to learn something that would explain the final mystery surrounding his background. Dr. Rodriguez, there are 17 other facilities containing personnel with specialized knowledge for post-collapse reconstruction. Engineers, logisticians, systems analysts, communication specialists. People who understood that rebuilding would require different capabilities than the original construction. Elena stared at him as the implications became clear. You're saying this was planned? Someone anticipated the collapse and prepared for systematic recovery? Someone recognized that complex civilizations are inherently unstable and that recovery would require people who understood how to optimize rather than simply operate the underlying systems, Marcus replied. The custodial approach to institutional change, gradual improvement rather than dramatic disruption. Elena realized that Marcus Williams represented just the beginning of a much larger transformation. Across the continent, other specialists were probably awakening to continue the process of systematic optimization that would prevent future collapses. As she watched civilian populations cooperating on infrastructure projects that crossed all former territorial boundaries, Elena understood that the janitor who had been preserved to clean up after the war had actually cleaned up the war itself by demonstrating that maintenance and improvement were more powerful than destruction and competition. The 63-year conflict was over, not because someone had won, but because everyone had learned there were better ways to solve problems than fighting about them. Marcus Williams had kept his promise to clean up the entire war, one systematic improvement at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.